Welcome back, everyone. I'll be speaking English for this panel because everyone else is speaking English. So we will try to speak slowly so that we can help our translators. Once again, I'd like to thank IBRAC and also thank here the partnership with USC. I would like to briefly introduce the panelists for the second panel. I could probably spend a very long time talking about each of their CVs, but I'll do a very brief introduction so that we don't lose a lot of time with that. So first we have Professor Ainda from the NYU Stern School of Business. He's the Heinz Hill Chair Professor of Business at NYU, and he holds a joint appointment in the TOPS and marketing departments. He is the director of the Masters of Business Analytics program at NYU Stern, and he's also senior consultant for Compass Lexicon. So thank you very much, Professor, for being here. We also have Professor Catherine Tucker. She is the Sloan Distinguished Professor of Management and a Professor of Marketing at MIT Sloan. She is also the chair of the MIT Sloan PhD program. It's also an honor to have you, Professor. Thank you very much. And last but not least, we have Daniel Sokol, who is a full-time law professor at the University of Florida, but that is just till the end of this month. Next month, he will be moving to being a professor of law at the USC Gold School of Law and business at the USC Marshall School of Business. He also serves as part-time senior advisor at White & Case. So once again, thank you all for being here today. It's really a pleasure, and I'm sure we're headed to a very interesting debate. Denny, I'll just hand it over to you for some initial comments, and then I think we can move on to the professors.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be back to chat with people in IBRAC. I'm just going to give some very brief overview comments. The most important thing is so much of policy is moving towards trying to understand digital platforms. One of the problems that we have is that we haven't really brought the tools of empiricism and the knowledge base of a number of business fields that are really dealing and are really at the forefront of data analytics and digital platforms. And I couldn't think to have two more distinguished scholars and really practitioners in this area than Ainda and Catherine. And Ainda, we'll let you get started. We'll have some initial comments by both, followed by some questions that Marcela and I will ask, and hopefully have time for questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Danny, for the introduction, and thank you, Marcela, as well. Very glad to be here with all of you and with Catherine as well. So what I thought I'll do this morning is, first, given the topic of the panel, I'm going to spend some time just giving everybody a flavor for, what really is business analytics, what is data science, and really how does AI fit in all of this. This is just to set up the stage for the second half of my talk, which I will try to connect this all to implications for antitrust, which is, obviously relevant in today's world. And so the sort of the experiences that I'll bring to bear are a combination of both practice and research. And I'm going to talk about, what I've learned doing this and what implication this has for regulatory agencies. Okay. So, first and foremost, I think from a practitioner perspective, the one question that is really on the top of people's minds is, what is the next generation of winning companies going to look like? Okay. We've all heard about, several successful stories from large tech companies, Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, et cetera, but who are the next generation of winning companies and what will they excel at? Okay. My sort of, prediction is this is going to be about those companies who are not just excelling at understanding the known needs of their known customers, but also understanding the unknown needs of their unknown customers. Okay, a lot of companies do a really good job at being able to estimate or predict what their current customers prefer and how they can please them and how they can satisfy their needs and wants. But not many companies are actually pretty good at predicting who their potential customers are and what might they want. And so now if you want to figure out who are your potential customers, that's where data science and analytics really plays a key role. You've got to, I'm going to talk about something known as the house of pillars, the house of analytics. There are 4 pillars in the house of analytics that are relevant to the current digital economy. And you'll see that those companies who are doing this a really good job are the ones who are eventually trying to predict the unknown needs of their unknown customers. Okay. So a couple of years back, now 3 years now, I wrote a book on this topic about how to monetize the digital economy. And to me, the winning companies will have 3 things going for them. First of all, they need to have a very strong, a very robust digital presence, because the digital economy is the most valuable and likely the fastest growing source of data about consumer behavior. If you don't have a strong digital presence, you're not going to get access to that data. Second, you have to invest in analytics and sort of the broader paradigm of AI, artificial intelligence. That's the toolkit that you will need to monetize the data that is coming out of the digital economy. And last but not the least, I'm also noticing that companies who are thinking forward, years from now, are investing in blockchain as an important instrument to ascertain the veracity of their data. Okay, this has very little to do with cryptocurrencies. The blockchain applications that I'm talking about are the ones that are used in the digital economy, such as in digital advertising, to ascertain the existence of fraud, ad fraud, for instance. Okay, so I think this is the framework that is really important in terms of combining sort of the phenomena and combining the toolkit. What I'd like to do next is really sort of talk about the applications of AI and analytics, and really from the very first principle, help us understand what is it really that data-oriented companies do or need to do. Okay. So, I think there's no argument that data is an asset. Now, how should companies who invest in data, how should they win with analytics and AI? So in a previous life, I was actually a mountaineer. I thought that was my calling in life. So I always like to give examples from the mountains. And to me, this is essentially a ladder as you sort of think about climbing from the base camp to the summit. You have to start investing in first principles. And the first principle starts with data engineering. Okay, it does not start with analytics. It starts with data engineering. What that means is you have to make sure that you're really spending time cleaning up the noise in your data, because real world data is never really served to you on a platter that looks very clean and glittery. It's generally always very noisy and very dirty. So a company that is thinking about monetizing data as an asset needs to think about investing in data scientists who will actually spend, a lot of time cleaning up the data. Okay, missing variables, omitted data, unformatted data, imbalanced panels. There's lots of other issues over there. And then once you have this, then you're ready to sort of unroll what I call the house of analytics. Okay. The house of analytics has 4 different elements to it. The data problem that you're solving can be either descriptive or predictive or causal or prescriptive. Okay, that's how you get business value. So let's look at some examples, right? So what's an example of a problem that is descriptive? A question that says, I would like to understand what happened using my data. That's an example of a descriptive problem. There, you're really using some very basic analytics like dashboards or prior business intelligence tools like data visualization. Okay. A second example of business analytics is predictive. This has obviously become very popular. Every small, medium, large company is thinking about understanding what will happen next based on what has happened so far, that's where we bring in sort of machine learning and data mining and text mining, forecasting, and I'll give you more specific examples very soon. A third pillar of business analytics is causal modeling. For example, you're trying to understand how do inputs impact outcomes. Okay. Here we run field experiments, we build econometric and statistical models, trying to understand the reason why consumers may behave accordingly in a certain intervention in an experiment. And finally, you have prescriptive. This is essentially thinking about how should you respond to these problems using optimization. But as you will see at the bottom, underlying all of these very exciting questions is the far more important but less exciting work of data engineering. Okay, and this is where a lot of companies fail. I was chief data scientist for 3TI in China for 4 years, and one of my biggest learnings through many years of failures and some successes is make sure we invest in data engineering as opposed to jumping into analytics right away. Okay, so let me give you some more examples, real-world examples of what businesses are using data analytics for. So I come from the intersection of technology and marketing, just like Catherine is. So for me, some of the exciting examples are customer service management or customer acquisition, channel management, churn reduction, trying to make sure you're not just acquiring customers but also retaining them. In the past, I've done some work with companies on supply chain as well. Here we are looking at yield optimization in hospitality industries like airlines and hotels and restaurants, or in the automotive industry, you're looking at predictive maintenance of different parts of a car. But then the applications go beyond these as well. There are other areas in human resource analytics, workforce productivity, fraud detection, and product feature optimization, and so on. In the world of marketing, which is obviously close to my heart, what we think is that the 4 P's of marketing are no longer what they used to be. Okay, so what data science has done, because of the proliferation of data and our access to very granular customer data, we now really revisit 4 P's. It's not the product, price, promotions, placement. To us, the four new P's are essentially about participation and people, about platforms, about prediction, and about phones. Okay, and so we, as a sort of data-driven organization, if you're thinking about understanding implications from a legal perspective, it's really useful to keep this in mind. Okay. How are different marketing companies using data in MarTech or AdTech? Lots of exciting examples from media and entertainment, from travel, from retail. In media and entertainment, we see a lot of churn management. In travel, it's a lot about predicting, people as they go through their path to purchase journey. In retail, we often see examples of recommendation engines and predicting lifetime value. In finance, we see a lot of CRM data analysis to be able to predict, lead closures for new account customers. All of these industries have a very clear-cut examples of how marketers and advertisers are using data. Okay. So hopefully this all gives you a pretty good perspective of, the broader ecosystem. So now let me sort of walk you through what I think are some of the implications from a legal antitrust perspective in everything that is going on. Okay, so first and foremost, I think we have to make sure that we revisit the definition of ad tech. We generally used to be told that ad tech was about a handful of large tech companies. But the reality is ad tech is really not about these 2 or 3 companies anymore. Some of the most exciting developments in ad tech come from industries outside of the platforms. So here are some examples. These are not meant to be exhaustive, they're just representative. But some of the most exciting work in ad tech is now being done by, for example, retailers like Amazon, Walmart, Target, by telecom operators like AT&T and Verizon, There are several digital platforms outside of Google and Facebook, which are the two names that we normally hear, that are doing some absolutely amazing, innovative work, like Snap and TikTok and Pinterest, and so on. Mainstream media companies like New York Times and Washington Post have invested in their own programmatic ad tech infrastructure, making them, viable choices for advertisers. Streaming media companies are doing an amazing job in investing in programmatic in connected TV. I strongly believe that Roku is today where Netflix was 10 years back. So, if you're into stocks, you should really be looking at Roku. Disney and Apple are doing an amazing job. Tech consulting companies like Accenture and Deloitte and PwC have transformed themselves into large media agencies, competing head-to-head with the likes of WPP, Omnicom, Publicis, IPG, and Dentsu. So really what all this means is advertisers today have far more choices than regulators may want us to believe. Okay? This is the one important message that you should take away, that it's not just about working with two companies, like two large tech platforms like Facebook and Google. They have several viable choices. In this list that you see, a brand today has a choice of working with several of these competitors, and they no longer are restricted to working with just these two names that you keep hearing. So what does all of this have, what implication does it have for antitrust in digital markets? So first of all, let's just define, what are some of the key features of these markets, right? It's quite obvious to me that there's been a continual entry and some exit, but a lot more entry of very innovative, companies who are tapping into shifting consumer preferences. There are network effects, both direct and indirect, and they have interesting implications for antitrust issues as well. Contrary to what regulators may want us to believe, there's actually more evidence that network effects does not act as a barrier to entry. We've seen increasing sophistication of consumer-level ad targeting across these platforms. No longer are we sort of restricted to those, banner ads that used to clog the whole screen. Advertising today is a lot more contextually targeted or behavioral targeted, and some of the new changes like Apple's IDFA and Google's third-party cookies are making changes in these as well. It's also important to note that the reason data is not a barrier to entry, another reason is that users actually multi-home. Okay, 54% of users on Facebook are also there on Snapchat, and 46% of users on Instagram are also there on TikTok. So when users multi-home, advertisers also multi-home, and that gives them access to additional sources of data. And the last point here is that regulators market most of the regulator arguments that I've seen coming from the European Commission or the Competition Markets Authority in the UK or even the Australian Commission, for example. I've seen that their market definition is actually very narrow. It's just implausibly narrow. It's based on what was historically maybe relevant, but it's completely outdated and not relevant anymore. So why is user data not a barrier to entry? First of all, like I said, given multi-homing, it's not accurate to say that user data resides on any platform. Look, there are multiple sources of data from third-party aggregators like Axicom, Epsilon, Expedient to alternative industry verticals like search engines and retailers, and the same examples I mentioned previously with news media sites and telecom operators and streaming TV companies. Okay. As programmatic advertising has become more ubiquitous, it has also reduced the switching cost for advertisers. Okay. And most importantly, having spent almost 20 years in data science and business analytics now, it really is one thing that has resonated is access to data doesn't make a company, is not a barrier to entry, because access doesn't make you powerful. It's how you harness it, what you do with it, how you leverage it. And there again, there are differences even within large tech companies of how successful they've been, because some have been able to leverage it much better than the others, even if they had, let's say, lower scale or smaller amounts of data. Okay. So in terms of how an example of how market definition by regulatory agencies has been very narrow and really not accurate, so two examples from areas that I work on, and so does Catherine, search advertising and display advertising. Okay, we are being told that search and display are different markets, and they're really not. I have my own research published, in 4 years back with a PhD student, Vilma Todri, who's now a professor at Emory, where we show that unlike the prior thinking that display advertising is only used for upper funnel brand awareness and search advertising is only used for lower funnel purchase, we actually show the opposite. Display advertising is very effective in lower funnel conversions and purchases, and search can be used in the upper funnel. Okay. So the conventional thinking about the path to purchase being based on IDA, awareness, interest, desire, action, is really not as relevant anymore. That's where the regulators haven't gotten it right. Okay. Budget allocation by advertisers is also not static. It's really very, very fluid. Okay. So overall, all this means is, look, there's been a lot of entry by new competitors that contradicts the notion of network effects as a barrier to entry. I mean, TikTok has been the largest, most downloaded app for the last 2 years in a row. Network effects are often localized in nature. This is really important for digital platforms and social media as opposed to global network effects. And finally, when it comes to consumer behavior, again, an area where regulators get it wrong across geography is they forget that consumers are very heterogeneous in their privacy preferences. There's no one homogeneous valuation of privacy, and that's because of this notion of privacy paradox, okay? Which basically means that there's a disconnect between what consumers actually say and what they actually do. So unless regulatory agencies factor in these current issues, and unless they stop, making arguments based on, issues relevant from years back, we are not going to see much progress. And I think this conversation has to be much more balanced. I think at this point, the narrative is very, very extreme, and I think they are doing a big disservice. And that's where we hope, to bring the conversation to the middle and make it more balanced. Okay. So that's pretty much all I had to say. And this is just a quick plug for my book. Some of these issues are actually mentioned here. The book has been translated in a few languages. I was actually hoping it will come out in Portuguese in Brazil, but then because of COVID, things got derailed. But I will remain optimistic that one day it will be translated into Portuguese as well. So I think my 20 minutes are up. So let me stop here, Danny, and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Anindo. Catherine, you've also been really at the cutting edge of this space for a number of years, and also have a nuanced background of how this digital transformation is impacting law. So one of the beautiful things here is that I have two professors of business who both have very nuanced understandings of the impact of business on law and regulation, both in terms of shaping regulation and law, but also in terms of how law and regulation might respond to some of these analytical insights. Catherine, take it away.
Oh, well, what a lovely introduction. And it is just amazing to be here. I know, and I'll just say what a privilege it is. Often as a professor, when you're talking to other professors, you've got a group of maybe 10, 20 people. But to see 100 people out here today listening is just wonderful. And it's such a pleasure to be doing this with both Daniel and Anindo. With that said, what I wanted to tell you about my presentation is I have come to hate slides on Zoom. And so if you like slides, the good news is Marcella's just posted slides and you can have that Zoom experience of seeing slides if you like it. But I'm not going to be showing them. I'm just going to be talking, but they are there if you're a slide person. So I feel like Daddy was alluding to the way I have been thinking about these topics now for 10 years, in that what happened, far too long ago, when I only had 2 children, not 4, I started realizing that there was this antitrust debate about whether or not big data was an essential facility, which exactly echoed everything I was teaching in class at business school. Now, what was the difference? Well, in antitrust, the worry is something a barrier to entry? Is it a source of sustainable competitive advantage, which could lead to monopolization? And that's the legal concern, but it's completely the opposite of what we do in business school. In business school, quite honestly, we spend our time trying to help our students identify barriers to entry, identify ways of having sustainable competitive advantage, identify ways of being able to maintain a price premium for a long time. So given that, I already had a framework in place, which I was using to help my business school students do something very different, to think about the question of whether or not data was a barrier to entry. Now, just the history here, and again, this has been some time, so I'm going to give this perspective, is that we've seen sort of cycles of popularity in terms of what we were worried about in, I think you might call it technology antitrust. We had switching costs, we had network effects, and then around, I think it was 2010, 2011, law professors started writing about the idea of big data. And it was an idea which I think has taken off. It's now articulated often in the context of data and AI and machine learning, as Ainda was saying. But there has been, I think, for now 10 years, this worry about whether or not data is a barrier to entry. And so what I've done is I've used the 3 criteria which I teach at business school to say, should we worry about big data, to actually evaluate, well, what is it that regulators should be worrying about when it comes to thinking about data and barriers to entry. And for those of you who like your legal speak, another way of thinking of this is these 3 criteria are going to be very much like how you might think about an essential facility in law. Now, the first thing you have to ask yourself when you're thinking about an essential facility or a barrier to entry is, well, does it create something of value? Simple thing to ask. And after Ainda's presentation, you may be completely convinced that, gosh, data is unlocking all this value in the economy. But I actually want you to think back to Ainda's mountain and think, actually, how much of that was real data and how much that was about complementary behaviors in the firm, such as data cleaning, hiring the right engineers, hiring the right people to think about how to unlock the value of that data. And, maybe another way of saying this is that when I talk to many young firms and entrepreneurs, usually the struggle for a firm is never the data. There's always data. The problem is how to make sense of the data. That is the really missing asset in our data economy. So if you want some academic research to help you think about the question of whether or not data is valuable, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some work I did with some data brokers. Now, data brokers are the players within the economy. You saw them in Ainda's presentation. Think of the big credit agencies. Think of firms like Axiom. And what they do is they just hoover up a lot of data in the economy, whether it be credit card data, whether it be web browsing data. They're going to take that together to try and give firms insights. What I did, though, was I went out to try and measure, well, how well are they actually doing at producing insights? And the way I did this was I simply looked to see how good data brokers were at telling me whether a cookie belonged to a male pair of eyeballs or a female pair of eyeballs. And so this cookie was arriving at a website. I simply said, data broker, is it female or male? And I actually knew if it was female or male, so I was really just checking their accuracy. And what I found was that it was accurate around 50% of the time. And given this is gender, you can see where that starts to get quite funny quite quickly. Now, why were they doing such a poor job, given these are highly sophisticated firms with an awful lot of data? It's just simply that, honestly, someone's gender is a really hard prediction task. If you look at, say, the people you're seeing on your screen right now in Zoom, and you think, well, could you tell whether myself and Marcella were female versus Danny and Anindo from what we've been looking at on the internet all day? Probably not, right? It's just a really hard task. And I think we often forget in the data economy, prediction tasks are really hard. And when we just ascribe any firm's success to data, we mustn't forget just all that complementary work which you can think of as being represented by Anindo's mountain climbing. All right, so big data. Look, data is incredibly valuable, has driven an amazing amount of transformation in the economy, but we mustn't understate how much of that value is coming from data, rather the processing and analyzing of data. All right. Now, the next question we always ask ourselves is, let's suppose something's valuable. Well, then, can another firm imitate that value? And that's always going to be a key question when we're thinking about either a barrier to entry or antitrust or an essential facility. If another firm can do exactly the same thing, well, that's not much of a barrier to entry, is it? And when I think about this question, what I always go to with big data is the question of, well, how easy is it to access similar insights? And I think the answer to that comes from how widespread a typical consumer's digital footprint is. Let me give you an example. So, as I just mentioned, I have 4 children, buy a lot of toys. And so let's imagine I'm looking for a toy shop in Rio de Janeiro. Well, then think about the data that is going to produce. I'm probably going to do a search on a search engine. I'm going to look at some reviews. I'm going to visit some websites. I'm going to take my cell phone to the toy shop. You're going to be able to track my location. In addition, I'm going to use my credit card for payment. In other words, so many firms will have the insight that I am the kind of person who is likely to buy toys. And so whenever we are thinking about how data could be a barrier to entry, the first question we need to ask is, well, is it the case that another firm can obtain similar insights from data, or are those insights really unique? Now, why is it? So that brings us on to our final criteria. So remember what we've had so far. We've had valuable. Do we have inimitable? And last, we have, do you control it? And what do I mean by controlling it? What I mean is, well, do you control the data? Or in some sense, does your consumer control the data in a way which means you can lose access at any one point? And what I always point to here is the existence of tools such as the iPhone switching tool, which have just made it so easy for firms to allow consumers to port their data. Now, if we go back maybe 10, 12 years ago, switching operating systems, be it from a BlackBerry to an iPhone, be it from Windows to Apple, was a painful process. But I would argue that the last 10 years has just seen an amazing evolution of tools for switching, which are very much facilitated by the move of data to the cloud. And for me, this is always a personal battle, because one thing as a business school professor I have to do is to think of examples of compelling switching costs. And for many years, I had my favorite example of switching costs, which was the iTunes store, in that I have a bunch of MP3s. I would really hate to ever buy an MP3 on a different platform, because it's such a hassle. You're never going to want to have your songs in different places. It meant that Amazon could come in 50% cheaper. You wouldn't see people switch. Now, what's wrong with that example? You know exactly what's wrong with that example. Spotify came in, destroyed my beautiful example, but that's just true of the digital age. That the moment you have any kind of switching costs in place, you have any kind of control, well, then firms are going to be deploying technology to try and undo that. Now, do I ever have any worries about this idea of control? Well, anytime I see compelling examples of times when consumers are single homing, this is echoing in Indo's multi-homing vocabulary, where you see one firm just enjoying access to the data. Well, what's the usual explanation? One explanation could be, of course, copyright. Another increasingly prevalent explanation is some degree of privacy laws. So a lot of my own research has been focusing on, well, the questions which come when you have a highly regulated industry such as healthcare, where privacy laws restrict the sharing of data in a way which actually allows firms to create information silos and potentially erect barriers to entry. So with that said, I've got to my punchline, and we're going to get to the more fun part of our discussion, which is where we ask questions, or you ask questions and we try and answer them. But I do want you to remember the framework I've gone through whenever you hear an antitrust question about whether it be data, platforms, AI, machine learning. Ask yourself, 1, is what they're claiming, is that phenomenon valuable? 2, can other firms do the same thing? And 3, can you actually control the value you're creating? So with that, let me hand it back over to Danny, and I can't wait to hear your questions.
Thank you. So Marcella and I will alternate questions. We have a number, and then we'll take questions as well. Let me start with an overview question. So it's something that, to a certain extent, you both alluded to. One aspect that has been missing from many of the competition policy debates has really been a focus on the positive, that is the value creation of platforms, and particularly the use of data analytics. We heard essentially from both of you, particularly from Indo, that if a number of firms were early adopters in the use of data analytics, what are some of the success stories that we have in digital transformation of new apps or platforms across industries that you would want to bring to a practitioner crowd so that they get a deeper sense of the value creation? So we might think, to a primarily competition crowd, the pro-competitive effects.
Okay. Do you want me to take a shot first, Danny?
We'll go in alphabetical order, sure.
Okay. All right. So I'll come to the punchline. Since you're asking for examples of companies that have done either apps or platforms that have done this well, let me talk about examples outside of the usual names, right? So, we all know about Facebook, Google, Amazon, but let me talk about the ones that we often don't talk about, but I think are pretty amazing examples. So let's start with Netflix. Okay, so Netflix, as I'm sure the whole world knows by now, is essentially a story of data-driven decision-making. Okay? Some of us here in the audience may know the example of the House of Cards, but you may not know that the genesis of the House of Cards, which is a Netflix-owned production, is really about their data science team mining their data to figure out that there are some people who like Kevin Spacey and some people who like British comedies and some people who like David Fincher. And there's 9 million people who are at the intersection of these three. So if they ever produce content that includes Kevin Spacey and directed by David Fincher and his British comedy, then they're at least going to get 9 million people to watch it. Okay? That's just one example of how Netflix mined its own data to create value, which then essentially just exploded over time. They came out with success after success after success, right? Let me take another example from the sharing economy, and that is essentially Uber. Okay, we are all used to different versions of ride sharing, whether it's Uber or Via or Lyft or Didi. But some of the most powerful data science work today in the world happens in these sharing economy companies. 2 years back, I was in Shanghai. I was talking with the head of data science at Didi, which is essentially Uber's rival in many parts of the world. And I thought what they were doing was it just blew me away. There's no other way for me to put it. That was far more, innovative or exciting data-driven work than I had seen anywhere, literally, even in some of the more large tech companies. Other examples, think about, PayPal and Square. These are, financial payment apps, but in my opinion, these are both poised to essentially disintermediate the banking and financial services industry and fast encroaching the market shares of the usual, suspects in the space like Visa, Master, and so on. I mean, then you can keep going on and on. There's Spotify, in social media, there's Snapchat and TikTok. I mean, who would have known 2 years back that TikTok would be where they are today, right?
My children did.
That's right. They're always far more forward-looking. So, I think there's lots of really exciting examples. And even outside of, the mainstream US market, I mean, look at what's happening in Chinese markets, for example, right, between JD and Baidu and Alibaba, and there's so much more innovation that is being driven by data. So I think lots and lots of examples there that we can take lessons from outside of the usual suspects in big tech.
And I also appreciate that in talking about Kevin Spacey, you mentioned the usual suspects in big tech.
No pun intended.
Yes. Catherine?
Right. So, what a wonderful answer from Indo. What I'm going to add to it is that when I'm asked to give examples, there's sort of two categories that I really focus on. The first is a lot of digital transformation and the use of data is far more boring than regulators think. It's far more revolutionary, but a lot more boring. And let's discuss that category first. And to do that, I'm actually going to talk a little bit about digital advertising. And whenever you talk to a regulator, a competition policy official, immediately when they think about data and digital advertising, they think about targeting or the practice of using data to identify the fact that we have various professors in California who just seem to love the usual suspects and Kevin Spacey and show them appropriate ads. That's what people think about when they think about data and advertising. But actually, the real revolution in advertising is far more boring than that. It's not about picking out those usual suspects lovers. It's about actual measurement. It's working out whether or not when you show an ad, anyone does anything. And that back-end transformation, the ability for advertisers to actually work out whether or not their ads work, that's been a far more fundamental and important shift than any of the usual things we talk about when it comes to the use of data in advertising. So the first thing I say is that, gosh, most digital transformation stories, we go to the sexy, to try and excite our students, but really it's quite boring most of the time. It's about measurements, it's about logistics, it's about efficiency. And we just can't lose that when we're talking about digital transformation. The other set of examples I wanted to give is that when we talk about digital transformation in companies, we don't often talk about, well, how does that affect equality in our society? And I think, if you think about most of the way we talk about digital platforms, it's got a very, should we say, elite focus and the experience of a certain incredibly economically privileged class of individual. But I want to just talk about two examples of why we can think of digital transformation as actually being about inclusivity and improving outcomes and reducing inequality. The first example I want to talk about is the use of data in healthcare, and in particular the use of data in digitizing patient health records. And what my research shows is that in the US, where we have massive disparities in the outcomes of how many babies die, depending on your race and background, actually this introduction of digital technology, digital data collection, actually helps reverse that underlying inequality. If you come up from a white privileged background, having data about your medical record really doesn't affect much about your potential outcome of your birth. On the other hand, if you come from a less privileged background where bad things tend to happen in the process of giving birth in an American hospital, then having that data record there has a really, really profoundly positive impact. So I do just want to mention, first of all, a lot of data transformation is boring, but also a lot of data transformation should also be thought of how, in some sense, it's improving society and reducing inequality. And I've talked for too long for one answer, but it's a passionate topic of mine. Danny, back to you. Well, actually, Marcella, I think it's your turn, isn't it?
Yes, it's my turn. I'm really excited to be asking questions now. So I think that switching up the topic a little bit, we've seen a really big growth in mobile and how this became relevant for competition, right? And particularly for advertising. And of course, mobile advertising is rather complicated. I know Aninda wrote an entire book about that, and there's a lot of questions to be answered, but I'd like you to offer, if you can, a little bit of insight into what are some of the critical things that competition authorities should ask when addressing mobile advertising, if you could.
Okay, sure, Marcella. Happy to share some thoughts. So, my take is there's at least three important things that competition authorities should account for in the context of mobile advertising, which I don't quite see them doing adequately enough. First is this issue of, return on investment. So in sort of digital advertising, we have gone from a world where we used to do very aggregate level analysis like marketing mix modeling into something known as attribution, digital attribution. The idea is because a consumer goes through different touch points in their journey, you really want to make sure you're using a more statistical or data-driven way to understand ROI as opposed to what many companies think about, which is last touch or first touch. The second issue is, going back to the notion of what is the role that mobile plays in the consumer's journey. Many regulators tend to think that, mobile is not relevant for the last touch point. It's not relevant for what we call the upper funnel or the first few touch points. That's actually not true. So I'll talk about that. The third one is the issue of privacy. This is highly connected to consumer behavior. Okay, so let me talk about the first one. So when we talk to, in my research, when I talk to heads of marketing, chief marketing officer or head of marketing in a company and ask them, why are you not investing adequately in mobile? Their typical response is, mobile is only responsible for about 4% of our overall sales, and that's not enough for us to make a tangible investment. What they miss out is that in the consumer's path to purchase journey, mobile can actually be far more significant. And when we have done attribution analysis, it turns out mobile has at least 40% impact on overall sales. And the reason is that, not every consumer has the same behavior on a mobile device. For a lot of us, smartphones is the first entry point into the journey. For some of us, it's the last entry point. And what this really means is competition authorities have to stop thinking of, different kinds of advertising as being separate markets. So mobile advertising is not a separate market from advertising that's happening on the internet. Or, like I mentioned in my talk earlier, search advertising is not, a separate market from display. There's a lot of fluidity across these touch points, and there's a lot of fluidity in how advertisers are changing and allocating their ad dollars. And unless these important and nuanced phenomena are fully understood, then we end up in a world where regulation will cause more harm than good. Okay, so I think we have to address this. And this ties directly into my second point that consumers, because they multi-home across multiple mobile apps, advertisers multi-home. And that means that they get access to newer sources of data. And so mobile advertising is no longer, we no longer have to think about only large tech companies enabling mobile advertising. Many app developers have the means and the infrastructure to enable that as well, using their own platforms or piggybacking on existing infrastructure. That gives brands more choices, which again means that if regulators do not consider the really larger portfolio of choices that brands have, we'll end up in a world where it is more harmful than good. Third thing is privacy, right? So, and I mentioned this before as well. Another reason why many companies have not invested adequately in mobile is they think that consumer reaction to their data privacy is going to be far more negative. But reality is that when we have done a lot of these large-scale experiments in different parts of the world, including in the places in Western Europe, which tend to have stronger privacy laws or considerations, and yet we consistently see that when mobile advertising is done right, consumers are actually willing to participate in entering into that relationship with companies where they share their own data willingly and knowingly what's going to happen with that. In return, they get convenience or benefits. Okay, so I think this is another big piece of consumer behavior with respect to data privacy that I don't see regulators really understanding very well. Okay, so I think let me stop there and hand it over to Catherine.
Right. Well, I'm actually going to try and be a little bit controversial, Marcella, and actually almost ask a question for Indo, which is, in my viewpoint, I don't think regulators should be talking about markets for mobile, because that suggests that there's something incredibly unique or special about mobile, which is not interacting with the broader digital economy. For an example, do I think that a focus on a mobile advertising market makes sense? Absolutely not. It just doesn't make sense to me to make a distinction between display on a desktop and display on a mobile, given they're being tracked by the same systems and measured in the same way. So now this is a question for you, Indo.
Yeah.
How does this make you feel? Given that you've written a book about the mobile economy, are you pro or against the idea that mobile is something special and unique that should be considered separately? Or, where do you think the barriers lie or the boundaries lie?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Catherine. So in my book, you will see, and I know you're familiar with it, but for the rest of us, I've identified 9 forces that are shaping this mobile economy, right? Now, a lot of us tend to think that mobile advertising is really only about location-based advertising, and part of the reason is that smartphones, the accuracy of location data has just improved dramatically in smartphones. But one thing that I wrote in my book is that there are 8 other forces in addition to location-based advertising that can be extracted from the same raw data. When a telecom company like AT&T and Verizon is engaging in location advertising, we also can see that in that data set, they have information about timing or about the crowdedness of the immediate vicinity or about the real-time weather in the city where it's happening. And so the thing that is unique, or I would say, really interesting about mobile advertising is that given the location data that can be tapped in real time, it actually lends itself to additional possibilities as well, outside of just desktop or internet advertising. Okay. And the other thing that makes it interesting is because consumers are carrying our phones with them all the time, you're getting this real-time access to new data. However, to your broader question, do I think that, so these unique opportunities are great for marketers to tap and leverage and get additional, value for money, but it doesn't mean that the regulatory issues at play here are going to be really different for digital versus mobile. I think there I would agree with you that there's a lot more overlap that at least I don't see the other side talking adequately about. So yeah.
Perfect, Fernando. Jenny, do you want to go for the next point?
Sure. So one of the questions that we got in the chat, I think, is a very important one given the nature of the Brazilian market. And that is, are there distinct lessons for digital transformation and competition specific to emerging markets? So not only have you told us that some of the way that we conceptualize competition may be wrong, but is the way we're thinking about it distinct, whether it's a BRIC country, and let's focus maybe on Brazil, or more broadly, right? Do these same kind of issues play out differently across countries?
Catherine, you want to take the first shot?
Okay, I'll take the first shot, which is that I'm going to give a very broad generalization, which is that my observation is that how these things play out across different countries is going to depend a lot on the regulatory capture within that country of major historic firms, whether they be media firms, whether they be newspapers, whether they be telecommunications companies. I think all of the economic forces that Ininda and I have discussed, which is the move to cloud computing, the ability to multi-home, the broad digital footprint, those all are universal forces. However, if you're in a country where there's been historic regulatory capture, then of course that can lead to distortions due to this point of control in terms of, it's obvious at that point that the control of data is sometimes limited by regulation. And so that's going to be my very general answer, which is the economic forces that we describe, I think, are universal. But I think the variation we see across countries depends on sort of incumbency legacy and degree of regulatory capture.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And the one thing I would add is, in addition to this, are there differences in consumer behavior across geographies in these emerging markets? Okay, that are different from, let's say, quote unquote, the Western world. In other words, do we have any evidence that consumers on digital platforms or mobile apps are behaving in some interesting different ways in the BRICS countries versus in the US or UK and Australia? I think if the answer to that is yes, and I'm not saying that is yes, but let's say there is some evidence there are interesting differences, that might be something that regulators consider to understand. Before you propose a regulation, you want to understand the reasons why people are behaving differently. So just to give an example, let's say that consumer responses to this idea of sharing data with companies or their preferences for privacy is different in Brazil and India and China versus the US or UK or Australia. If that were to be the case, then first and foremost, I think it's incumbent for entities involved here to understand why that is the case. Is this driven by culture? Is it driven by exposure to some new phenomena or understanding the reason for the difference? Only then can you actually have meaningful regulation, right? So I think that's, to me, Danny, I'd sort of, echoing some of Catherine's point, but adding the consumer behavior angle to this.
Sure. Makes a lot of sense. And I think that connects to another question that we had, which is that there's a common discourse, especially in the reports that came out regarding digital markets and the use of data by digital companies, that, data can be used to enhance users' experience in a platform. But how and if we can use, any tool that we have to distinguish if innovation is really benefiting consumers, or if the platform, in fact, is just to some extent benefiting from users' potential biases, right? And I think that perhaps may be something that can change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and even from culture to culture, from group to group of consumers naturally. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that particular topic.
I could speak to innovation and sort of consumer benefits from that. I know Catherine's done a lot of work on biases, algorithmic biases. Maybe she can talk about that. So look, I think it's fair to say that in general, innovation is friendly to increasing consumer surplus, controlling for the end consumer pricing, right? Like this is just basic 101 economics, that innovation tends to benefit consumer and increase surplus, conditional on what their end price point is, right? So in other words, if innovation actually leads to higher end pricing for consumers, then the effects are not very clear, because you're clearly getting some value from the innovation, but then you're also having to pay a higher price. If, however, innovation is happening in a way where there is no immediate relevance of pricing, like in much of the digital world, there is no notion of a real price. There's no product price or service price you're paying. You're not really spending real dollars or whatever the currency is. You're essentially getting subsidized content, exposure to advertising, right? As opposed to in the old analog economy or the traditional economy, where it was clearly, pricing involved. So if Amazon is innovating in some amazing ways using recommender systems or machine learning or personalized pricing, but that leads to a higher end price for consumers. If that is the case, then you can see examples where innovation may not be consumer friendly, okay? As opposed to a company like Snapchat or Facebook or Google, where there is no product there's no price that a consumer is paying in explicit dollars. And so, Marcel, I think the answer to that question really is you have to take this case by case, right? Different industries are different because the end product is different and pricing implications are different. Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, no, I was just going to add, if that's all right, that when I hear questions like this, it always sort of defeats, it suggests to me that someone has missed the entire point of what a two-sided platform is. And let's be clear, a two-sided platform's job is to happily match users with something on the other side. And so the idea that in general, platforms have incentives to diminish welfare for their users, distort their experience, just doesn't make any sense to me, given that the primary job of any tech platform is to make those users happy to keep them on the platform. So that's a sort of first order point. Now, I like the way Anindo's saying it, though, which is that, can we think of the potential for case-by-case distortions of this principle where somehow users are trapped, they can't multi-home, information can be distorted? Yes, of course. But I think we can't miss or ignore the first order principle, which is that platforms have all the right incentives to be continually improving user welfare because they need to keep them using their platforms. So sorry, I interrupted you, Danny. I get upset by this question.
I was actually going to just ask you to give some comments, so it was actually perfect. I would like then maybe to ask an additional question, one that we haven't gotten to, and one that I think from the policy side is very important, which is that across jurisdictions, and in this sense, Brazil is no different than other jurisdictions, there is increasing regulation of digital issues across a number of different dimensions by different sector regulators, both on the competition side and sometimes on the privacy side, and sometimes it's the telecom regulator, sometimes it's the financial regulator / banking regulator, and others. And as is often the case when you have multiple regulators with multiple constituencies and multiple goals, we get a bit of a mishmash. And by the way, Catherine, I should also add, since you brought it up, health regulators being yet another one. Is there some sort of unified framework that regulators, regardless of where they are in the government, should use to address digital markets, especially given some of the insights that both of you have offered, that different platforms have different business models and different potential regulatory issues?
So, Danny, I think the answer to that is that, again, this is my personal opinion. I think it's incredibly difficult to have a unified framework for regulation in digital platforms, simply because the issues at stake here are very different. Okay, so what do we mean by that? Let's just take the three examples that we are all aware of: Amazon, Facebook, and Google, right? So the European Commission's issue against Amazon, what is it? Basically, they're saying that Amazon has access to some valuable third-party sellers' data on its platforms, which it then uses allegedly in an unfair way to promote its own products. It basically builds the same best-selling products and labels it as Amazon products. And the European Commission alleges that it is unfair because it is getting access to data from its third-party sellers on its platforms. However, the counter-argument to that, I would think, is that's exactly what Target and Walmart and Costco and Sears have done for 50 years. They have, in their physical retail environment, they have figured out the best-selling products and launched their own in-house branded labels under their own names, right? So how is what Amazon doing different from what they have done? Second issue is the whole definition of market. Is Amazon just an e-commerce company or is it a retail company? Okay, I think there are arguments on either side, but there are no black and white answers to that. And unless you define the market what it is, how do you even consider launching, a question of, did somebody become large by bad conduct, right? So a lot of antitrust is market share by bad conduct. How do you prove bad conduct? Okay. Second, look at the current, the litigation against Facebook, for instance, right? It's primarily about the mergers, acquisitions, etc., of Instagram and WhatsApp by Facebook, the parent company. those issues are very different from the Amazon issues. Amazon issues is about access to data leading to unfair pricing possibilities, etc. This issue is about mergers and acquisitions. The third lawsuit, antitrust lawsuit, allegedly against Google in the US, again, look at the issues at stake. They're really about the alleged monopoly or market share, market power that Google has in the ad tech world and in the search world. Okay? That is really about a whole different set of issues compared to what Amazon and Facebook is facing. So I just think that, again, to your question, is there a unified framework possible? I find it difficult because I think the issues at stake are very different. Okay? This is not like regulating oil companies or telecom companies in the 80s or oil companies in the 70s. They're all producing the same product, right? All the oil companies produced oil. All the telecom companies had telecom services, right? We had voice and we had text. We didn't have internet and data then. Today, things are very different. So that's how I see things.
Well, that's I don't think anyone can argue with this. It's just always amazing when you're in this discussion how you often hear people refer to tech platforms. And then as time goes on, you actually mean they got one very specific one in mind. And that all they're saying really doesn't apply to the other ones, but they don't seem to have noticed. So I think what Linda said was incredibly useful. I'll just add to it. And this is sort of building on what Danny was saying, asking me about, well, what's the role of sectoral regulation? And I actually have a positive viewpoint there. I think that, in general, though it's tempting and sexy to have some kind of digital platforms authority trying to do all of these things for these very different disparate firms, if we actually think about the kind of outcomes we're often worried about, or those kind of bad things that Aninda was mentioning, those edge cases, well, a lot of them are to do with certain specific groups or specific sectors. So, for example, we may worry about health outcomes, health data, health privacy. There seems to be a reason for treating that separately, potentially, to really regulate around the specific issues there. Similarly, there are some types of data or platforms which could potentially affect gravely people's financial outcomes in terms of insurance and housing search. If we're worried about that, let's regulate that separately. And similarly, we also may want to have special protection for special groups. For example, the use of children using platforms and how we think about protecting them in this digital environment. And so I would tend to argue that rather than trying to say we have this phenomena of platforms, we should regulate them. Instead, we should really focus on, well, what are we worried about as a society? Are we worried about people's healthcare, economic outcomes? Are we worried about protecting children? And let's actually regulate that to be outcome orientated.
Perfect. And following that line, what I understand from both of your opinions is that first, adopting general regulation that is, generally thinking about data usually probably will not work, given the different approaches that data can have in different industries and so forth. But I'd like your thoughts on one idea that has been widely discussed, again, departing from the reports by competition agencies that have been carried out in the last 2.5 years, more or less, which is the general idea of portability / interoperability, right? So basically granting access to competitors to data that is owned by given companies, that is collected by given companies, in order to, strengthen competition. I think that is considered today as something that should be done. We don't know exactly how, we don't know exactly what the impact of that will be. And my question would be, what do you perceive the effects on competition and on the business environment would be, considering especially incumbents, if the incumbents were forced to share their database with rivals and entrants. And that sort of connects to how much economies of scale in the treatment of data and derived AI development is indeed a barrier to entry or not. So very much would like comments on that. Thank you.
Sure. So, first of all, I would say, so it's an interesting topic because, this one actually has, more nuances embedded in it than maybe some of the others. So again, one thing that I mentioned before in my talk, when I was using my slides, was that here are the reasons why user data is not a barrier to entry. Number one, multi-homing by users. Number two, access to other sources of the same data, such as third-party, brokers, for example, or DMPs is another example. So I think the problem that regulators may be trying to solve may be a smaller problem than they think, okay? Because there are alternate sources of data. That said, what do I think about interoperability of data? Sure, in principle, it's not a bad idea to allow a company to be able to share their data with a potential new entrant. There are two issues here. In some angles, this sounds a little bit vindictive. It sounds a little bit like a punishment. You've grown to be a successful incumbent, and now you're forced to share your data that you have collected, through hard work. You're now being forced to share with a new entrant. Let's say this is not the case. Let's say it's not a punishment. Okay, fine. The second issue that arises is the issue of consumer data security. So interoperability, or the ability of a large incumbent to be able to share data with a new entrant. Suppose there is a data breach that happens. Who is now responsible for that? Will you go and blame the incumbent for the data breach that happened during the process of this transfer, or if it happened on the premises of a third-party institution? I think until and unless we solve these problems that protect the parent company from future litigation in the event of a data breach, it just seems like the tables are stacked against the incumbent companies to start with. Okay. So yeah, I would look at it from two angles. One is, A, I think we actually have more sources of data than people think. B, if you do not believe the first argument and you want to enforce data interoperability, are you sure you're able to then protect consumer data? Or how do you deal with security breaches? Okay.
So I know we're reaching the top of the hour, so I'll be brief. For me, this question just shows the inherent tension between what we try and do in consumer protection regarding privacy and what competition authorities might want to achieve. In that, what's a perfect example of a large tech firm sharing data with a edge firm trying to build up a marketing analytics capacity? Well, that sounds to me much like Cambridge Analytica, right? And so anytime I hear suggestions like that, I'm sort of hearing like, don't you realize you're suggesting that Cambridge Analytica is exactly what we want to be doing? And just sort of some thoughtfulness about the tension and what's being proposed, I think would be very welcome. So I'll just say that and hand it back to you.
There were a few questions, and actually, Marcel, I wonder if you could just bundle them very quickly together. We can have maybe either response to these bundle or in the alternative, or maybe not in the alternative, but a combined answer this bundle and perhaps somehow frame it as your concluding thoughts. Here we're mixing, matching of different data sources in ways that hopefully work out. Marcela?
Sure. We have one question from the audience, which is, and it's a description of basically antitrust intervention throughout the years, mainly in the US. And then the question moves on to ask how to potentially design or inform legislation to prevent monopolization from one firm, and which basically leads to monopolization from some other firm. And it's a question from Claudio Lucinda, and he mentions the AT&T case leading to dominance by IBM, and then the IBM case leading to potential dominance by Microsoft. And all of these companies were to some extent a small startup, and then they were they became leading firms. In my view, just to offer some quick comments about the question itself, I mean, I think the first question that I would ask you is whether you think that is a problem, right? Because, some people would simply say, yeah, so that's how things are supposed to work. You have in these digital markets, you have one company that is initially very small and then becomes very large with time. And then, monopolies go over one another, sort of in a Schumpeterian kind of way. So if you could bundle that with perhaps your final comments, that would be great.
So I'll just be very brief here. I especially like the last sentence of the question about the Titanic. It's about shuffling chairs on the Titanic. It might feel that way. I think, look, my sort of overall takeaway is regulation has a role, but it's not quite clear to me if we are barking up the wrong tree at the moment. I think there are, other kinds of regulation that probably merit more attention, like the whole issue of Section 230, which is the issue of freedom of speech versus runs the responsibility of a platform to be able to control the speech. I think there are bigger issues at play here, such as the impact of fake news and misinformation that is clearly playing a role in the society, and we should really be focusing our goal, on those issues and empowering the platforms to deal appropriately with those issues, as opposed to what a lot of is going on today. So I think that's sort of my personal opinion, that there are issues at stake that regulations can play a role, but I don't think we are focusing adequately on those more pertinent issues.
All I'll add, just as we're finishing, is, my gosh, that question for me just shows the complete beauty of innovation and just the extent to which there's a huge reason to be incredibly optimistic that the digital economy will continue to produce the amazing benefits that it's produced so far. So I'll end with those stone words and hand it over to our moderators.
Marcel, if I could just say a few quick things before you wrap up. The first is this is a wonderful opportunity for us to introduce the USC initiative on digital competition, which is in the Marshall School of Business. What we're trying to do, and here we're lucky because both Anindo and Catherine are, in fact, our research affiliates in the center. It's in the initiative, but we're trying to bring together, essentially create a collision of insights across disciplines and across different communities, academic, practitioner, policy, and disseminate these kinds of insights. So we'll have more events. I also want to note that in the law school at USC, I'll be heading the Center for Transnational Law and Business. And Marcel, we're very thrilled to have you as a member of what we call our digital study group, where we have people from the Americas who get together on a regular basis, monthly, to just sit and try to understand better what seems to be literally weekly developments, sometimes in parallel, sometimes in contrast with each other, in this digital competition space, where I think this week we are launching that website where we're going to have a digital tracker of different types of digital regulations and cases and investigations and proposed legislation across jurisdictions. And with that, Marcelo, I'll thank you and IBRAC very much for hosting this event, and of course to Anindo and Catherine for their very insightful comments.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you all, and thank you Anindo, thank you Catherine, and thank you again Daniel for the partnership, and we hope this will bring many other events in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all again on behalf of IBRAC. And I think it was a very productive discussion. So I know you all have a hard stop now at noon. So please feel free to leave. I'll have some only small comments for the Brazilian group from IBRAC here. Small announcement. So thank you very much. So I'll switch to Portuguese now. Novamente reforçando o agradecimento aqui para o grupo, todos os panelistas e os participantes. Acho que foi um evento que a gente desenvolveu e foi conseguindo as confirmações ao longo do tempo de forma bastante delicada e bastante cuidadosa para realmente conseguir uma discussão mais aprofundada sobre o tema de dados, e acho que realmente conseguimos lançar luz aqui de uma forma um pouco diferente, de uma discussão mais geral, de um senso comum que por vezes vai se formando sem um debate com quem realmente lida com isso no dia a dia. E essa era a intenção da nossa discussão aqui hoje. Então, agradeço a todos. A gente em breve vai enviar a gravação do evento de hoje e também as apresentações que ficarem disponíveis para a gente. Em breve também a gente vai circular a nova data da reunião do comitê, e lá a gente discute a agenda das nossas próximas atividades. Então, muito obrigada a todos e encerrado aqui o evento.